Thank you very much. Can the people hear? Yeah. I need to start off by saying, am I a photographer? God knows. I started off as a photographer, and when Tim asked me to do this, I originally said no, I don't really think it will fit. But really, the outcome of my work is a photograph in the end. But for me, as Tom said yesterday, it's just a medium. Photography is a medium. Don't ever lose that. It's not the message, it's the medium. Everything I've done for the last nearly 8 years has been using the photographic medium to produce what I think of as art. So when Tim asked me to do this, I thought, well, I'm going to talk about my own journey in photography and in landscape, because the two didn't always go in parallel. I'm going to start off with this image. It's a Bill Brandt image, and it's actually taken in Halifax, which is nowhere near where I was brought up. But I was born and brought up on a council estate in Salford. My upbringing was quite hard, I think. Certainly the landscape wasn't anything to do with it. And this picture feels like my childhood. Whenever I look at it, I think that was my childhood. Being with a group of mates, almost feral. The childcare policy on the estate I lived on was basically you were chucked out after breakfast and you were told not to come back till dark. And we got up to all sorts of stuff. But our playground was industrial places, canals, railway lines, factories, chimneys. It was the Salford of L.S. Lowry. And in fact, I had an art lesson from L.S. Lowry once, which is another story, but that's... So a lot of freedom, very little education, and a lot of misbehaviour. I found this picture recently. I think it's a John Davis picture. If anyone knows who did this picture, please let me know later.
John Davis.
It is John Davis? Yeah. Well, this is part of my playground. This is my territory. We used to cycle to this place, and then we would freewheel down the hill on our bikes to the other side of the power station where there was a canal which had a warm water outlet into the canal, so there was loads of fish. And we used to buy 5 woodbines on the way and sit all day fishing, spitting, and catching fish and smoking. So that was my childhood. So years later, I saw this picture somehow, and it is I think it's the root of all my work since. It's another Bill Brandt picture. It's called Gull Eggs 1948. I think it's taken on Sky. But it was the first picture I'd seen that had kind of lots of things going on in it. There was a horizon, there was a lock, there was another dark patch, there was some textured foreground, there was the shape of the eggs, the colour of the eggs, the shape of the nest. And it just lodged in me somewhere and stayed in there and slowly has come out over the rest of the years. But I ended up from this upbringing and this sort of strange start doing a fine art degree in Newcastle. And as I arrived, I thought, what am I going to make art about? What am I doing here? I didn't really want to be a painter. It was a kind of it was 1971 I went there, so painting was dead. I didn't want to be a sculptor. It looked like too much like hard work. But at the time there was this kind of movement of gritty, hard-nosed documentary photography. Circa Lisa Cotignan, Chris Killip, these people going around council estates, places I was brought up, making work. So, and the other thing is, when I arrived doing a fine art degree, there was a photography room with a cupboard with the most amazing equipment and the most amazing materials. And a guy ran it called Jeff Lowe, who had been a photographer in the RAF. He didn't know much, but he knew how to develop a film and process stuff, and we learned a lot together with the Ilford Manual of Photography, which was the Bible. So I just, and to this day, I met my wife in that first year at art college, and we're still together 49 years later or whatever, and she's still bitter about the fact that she was a painter and she used to have to pay for her canvases, pay for her paint, pay for a canvas stretchers, whereas the photography room, everything was free. You just opened the cupboard, took as much as you wanted and walked away, and nobody said a word. So it was fantastic. So I started off doing these projects myself, very much after Bill Brandt. I went to Ashington, to the sea mining area, and there was these people digging sea coal on the beach. I think Bill Brandt had done a photo essay about it in Picture Post or something. And this guy was a bit of a gang leader. He seemed to be in charge of these guys filling sacks with tiny, tiny pieces of sea coal and putting them on this horse and cart and taking them off. Later on in the day, I was chased down the beach by a guy with a shovel who thought I was from the DSS taking photographs. But you'll see they're all squares. I'd taken a rolly cord out of the cupboard, and so my first real photographic experiences was with a 2 1/4 square camera handheld. I think now looking at these pictures, they're about class, and I think they're about the fact that I'd ended up in this very middle class environment, unsure of myself. Everyone else seemed to be from the south of England or gone to very good schools, and I didn't. So all my work, now I look at it and it's about class. Nobody mentioned that to me at the time. So I invented these projects. I found an illegal dog racing track run by miners on a Sunday morning. So I used to get up really early and go to this dog racing track. Yeah, a student who got up early on a Sunday morning, that's a novelty. I also think I did some things like point-to-point racing, where I think I was kind of poking fun at the middle class, something like that. I did a project about Hexham Cattle Market. I look at these now and they're kind of quite interesting social documents. I didn't think that they were at the time, but when I left college, it was a very unhappy time for me. I thought I had nothing to offer, and I vowed to myself that I would carry on making photographs, but I would have to get a job. I couldn't see a way of making a living, so I went to a job in local government where I worked for 20 years and did my art and photography alongside it for 20 years until it became just too much and I had to make a decision, just like Theo said this morning. I spent a lot of time looking out the window thinking, why am I here? But I started to do kind of travel pictures. I bought myself, in preparation for today, I watched last year's talk by John Blakemore, and he just says a little thing at the end. He said, oh, all these are taken on a knicker mat, and it's the pinnacle of camera making. Everything was downhill after that. I mean, it's true. I bought myself a knicker mat, and I decided I was going to be a Cartier-Bresson street photographer, the decisive moment. So we did a lot of travelling. This was in Paris, outside the Pompidou Centre. There was a mime artist getting ready for his act. This was a fish market in Spain. But I had a crisis of conscience in Paris one day. I was on the Boulevard Haussmann. There was a Vietnamese woman looking very distressed, breastfeeding a baby, sat on the floor with a card. She was begging. And I thought, what a great photograph that would be. What a great photograph. Got the camera, thought, she just looked too distressed, and I thought, I'm taking advantage of this woman by photographing her, and it's just not right. So I gave her some money, went on my way. So what happened was that people started to disappear out of the photographs. I was never that comfortable with it. I've always felt a bit self-conscious, feel I had taken advantage of people's lives or whatever. So I started to do these kind of, this was in California. The car is king in California. So I was going to set up that, but in parallel with all this, something else was happening. I'd met Margaret, who was my wife, been my partner for 48 years, and she was brought up on a farm in Kent and was a kind of ruralist painter. So she started to introduce me to landscape, and I didn't know it existed. And at the end of my first year as a student, I got a job working at Richard Johnson and Nephew's wire drawing mill in Manchester, which was an incredibly dangerous place, white hot wire flying around, cyanide fumes everywhere. But it earned me enough money, and I bought a Morris 1000 van for 40 quid. and we went up to Scotland. This was our first trip, and I saw this. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. I didn't know places like this existed on our island. It wasn't part of my upbringing at all. On the second trip we went up to Scotland, I discovered this wall, and it became a bit of an obsession. In fact, after I did a talk down in on the south coast at Bournemouth, a big conference like this, and a woman did a blog post after it, and she said she feared for my mental health, and she thought I needed some kind of therapy because of my obsession with this wall. But it's on the Applecross Peninsula, just north of Applecross, a place called Lombane, and it was a dry stone wall created probably 400 years ago, and the village is then cleared as part of the Highland clearances, and it's just on a little plateau above the beach. Every stone in the wall is beautifully round because they're all collected off the beach, and so each stone shape was created by the sea, by centuries of being rolled around in the sea, and each stone in the wall was covered in the most beautiful lichen. And I did this picture, which is the first picture I think was my own picture, my own voice, my own idea. That it's the first time I'd done anything where there was two things going on, and they're both diametrically opposed things. One, it's a dry stone wall created by a man or person's hand, created and then left to the elements. But also there's an idea in there about a planet. There's an idea about the moon. There's an idea about these links between something very small around your feet and something huge and vast. And it was from that was the single idea that I latched onto. And my work ever since has been linked to that kind of principle. The wall has just got the most beautiful stones in it. This was my favourite stone. And each of these next 4 pictures were taken 2 years apart. So 2 years. 2 years. By this time I had a job and I was working, so I was only spending a week a year going away to Scotland. I probably exposed about 10 rolls of 120 film, and I spent the rest of the year processing them, printing them, doing little drawings about what I was going to do next time I went. But this year it rained every day, so every single day I was out, it rained, so I couldn't take a picture of the stone dry. 2 years later, different matter. The other thing that's happening here is also my work in the darkroom was getting better. I was doing a lot more dodging and burning, and actually creating this circle in a black square, which is a motif that I still use today. And it comes directly from this wall and these stones. The next kind of stage was to move away from this wall and start to photograph the beach around the wall, down to the sea, finding the same shaped stones, but kind of photograph them in a different way. I saw in Sandra's talk some of these scintillations. Basically, if you got into the sun and had a 1/4 of a second exposure, any light that was bouncing off the water would just play around on the film for a 1/4 of a second and leave these kind of calligraphic kind of marks. This was a really special day because I arrived at the beach and I was sort of working, and it started to rain, that very misty rain you get in Scotland, and slowly over a couple of hours enough water stayed on top of the stone to start dripping down the sides, and I took this picture. And I'm very proud of this picture. In fact, this picture, a copy was bought by Andy Goldsworthy, was on his living room wall. I was very proud of that. This is the first picture I engineered. I was at a beach all day and I saw a rock pool with a stone in it, and it sort of filled up the tide filled it up from the bottom. So it didn't fill up in one wave, it just filled up slowly and left this dry stone around this, and these sort of shafts of light. And I worked out that one day, that the next day, I think that the tide will come up and the sun will be right opposite the stone. So I kind of set my camera up and waited and waited and waited and waited, and it just did it. The water had risen to the right level. The sun was directly opposite my camera, and it was a kind of magical moment. The next stage of the work was what I call landscape within landscape. I started to go around the beach and find lines and shapes that were kind of echoes of big landscape. It's just this idea about, I'm looking at my face. I don't do a lot of climbing or walking. As B.B. King said, I was built for comfort, not for speed. And so a lot of my work is finding these things around your feet. You don't have to go to, sorry Tom, Tierra del Fuego or southern end of Portugal. But you can just look around your feet and find interesting things. I look at this one now and I think I would move the shell. But at the time I was very into just photographing what was there. This is a picture of me at the wall with coloured hair. Remember that? What happened was I got better at it. So I was doing these one week a year photographing, the rest of the year processing. And now by July, I used to go at WIT every year. That was my WIT week. I was processing the films and I was finished by July. And I was kind of thinking, what do I do now? So I started playing around with negatives that nearly had worked, but they wouldn't make a great photograph in themselves, but actually sections of them worked. So what happened was I started to make pictures in the darkroom with two negatives. At the bottom of this is a stone from the wall, and I would print the bottom half of the picture. I would change the negative in the enlarger, turn the baseboard upside down, and pray that the thing was still in focus, and then print the top half of the picture, which was a bit of the edge of the sea, slow motion. And it was liberating. It was liberating in shape. Suddenly my pictures didn't have to be square. It was liberating in terms of I could kind of create my own images, my own work, from sections of other bits of work that hadn't been entirely satisfactory. Just a bit of lichen-covered rock, and then the top part is the bottom of a waterfall just turned upside down to kind of create this cloud sort of shape. The next kind of motif, so we've got this circle in a square motif, and the next motif that comes along is a horizon line. So I used to spend hours just walking around looking at rock pools, finding just the edges of rock pools that looked like a horizon line from a long way away. And so I started to kind of make these. Somebody yesterday mentioned Miles Davis, I think it was Tom. I did these in winter near Elgol, and I hadn't thought about it. I went in winter and I hadn't thought about the light. I hadn't thought about the fact that it was going to be dark by about 2:30 and not light until about 11 o'clock in the morning. So I had these little windows of opportunity to go out and make images. But it would just rain. I was in a cave. I sat in this cave near Elgol for ages and ages and ages, listening to Miles Davis on a Walkman. So all these pictures are called In a Silent Way. The other thing that I created at doing these pictures was I would set the camera up, I would focus it, get everything right, and then I would wander along the beach and find a bottle, a plastic bottle. You find them everywhere. I've never been on a beach yet that you don't find a plastic bottle. I would fill the plastic bottle with seawater and douse the whole area, and then make the exposure while the water was kind of running off, and you got this kind of metallic light coming off them, but also you got a reflection of the clouds in the image. So there was I thought they were dead simple images, but there was a lot going on, and I thought I was really happy with them. I went through a very strong Andy Goldsworthy phase, because what happened was I was doing all that work in the darkroom, and it was really hard, and the success rate was really, really low, because you didn't know till the end if these two pictures had joined together properly, and when you processed it, you would end up with this kind of white line across the middle. So I started to think, well, maybe I could just do the work in the landscape rather than in the darkroom. So I kind of started to do strange things in the landscape. So I covered a stone from Scotland in silver leaf and took it back to Scotland and photographed it in streams, and placed stones in the middle of very precarious slippery streams to photograph them. This one I found a phial of silver powder, genuine silver powder, which I just sort of spread on a stone in the rain, and these huge raindrops were hitting the silver and splashing it over everything. I was also taking stuff back to the studio and photographing it at home. I say studio, I mean living room floor. It wasn't a great studio, but we had a patio doors, and you could get really nice light coming in from the patio doors. And I ended up thinking it was just too easy to bring back beautiful stones and beautiful shells and photograph them. It just seemed to be too easy. So I invented this idea called a day at the beach, where I would walk on a beach, I'd have a carrier bag, no camera, and at the end of my walk, as far as I got along the beach, I would just stop and take 2 or 3 handfuls of sand or whatever was at my feet, put it in the bag and take it home, and force myself to make an image out of it. And this was a kind of seminal picture in my work, because it was some carrier bag full of beach from the Isle of Muck, and just laid out on some black velvet on the living room floor. I sifted out the shells into a sort of rectangle. I should have said, I've missed a bit out really, that going back to the wall time and time again for about 18, 20 years, one day I turned up and there was a huge fence in front of it. The landowner had decided to put a deer fence in front of the beach, and the wall became inaccessible. So this kind of rectangle started to appear in my work, and it was sort of symbolic of this fence, how you couldn't get to the landscape because somebody had made a fence in front of it. So this rectangle starts to appear. At the same time I brought this bag full of beach back, I also brought a bottle of seawater back, and the intention was I was going to douse the construction with seawater. But actually, playing around in the studio, I realised that this seawater dried in patterns that was very interesting. So I started just to try and make work out of seawater, nothing else. I thought this is the ultimate, if I'm being true to myself about making complex, thought-provoking images out of less and less promising material, what's the most ultimate of that? A teaspoonful of seawater. How can you make a great image out of a teaspoonful of seawater? So I just started to use acetate film and dry seawater on it. And it suddenly kind of clicked that it was quite interesting. There was an interesting thing going on. I would then put these constructions in an enlarger, shine light through them, and make black and white exhibition prints of them. There was a kind of hard edge between success and failure. Controlling the seawater drying was really hard, because it did what it wanted to do. You would get a humid day, and a thing you'd been working on for 2 or 3 days would just turn back to water, and it was hard. Rust, I found a few washers on the beach and started to dry seawater under rust. And of course, because we're talking about black and white photography, the red of the rust held back the light in the dark room, so you got a lot more depth to these images. They were very difficult to print. I mean, those of you in the audience, and I'm finding less and less and less people who know about darkroom photography, they're not really negatives, they're just like bits of acetate or glass with a whisper of dried seawater on. And the tolerance between overexposure and underexposure is really high. And the other thing is, as I put them in the enlarger, they used to dry out and change. So I could get 2 or 3 great prints out of one of these constructions before they would just disintegrate. In 2000, I got a letter. I'd left work by this time, and I'd had a London show, and things were getting good for me. I got a letter in the post from the Ballinglen Arts Foundation of Philadelphia, saying, we've seen your work in a show in London, we really like it, we want to make you a life fellow of our foundation. And we have a place out in County Mayo on the west coast of Ireland, and as a fellow you can go and live and work there when you like. And I thought it was a wind-up. I do have friends who are capable of doing such a wind-up. So I put this letter away for a few days and just didn't. I thought, that can't be real. That can't be real. And eventually I looked at it and got in touch with the people, and it was true. And I got invited, and the first time I went for 3 months. This is a stack at the end of where the foundation is, a little village called Ballycastle in County Mayo. And this is my friend Charlie Hadcock, the sculptor, who came over to see me while I was working there for 3 months. And it was a beautiful, beautiful place. And I was making images like this on the beach. So this was, I would look around and find a beautiful bit of quartz rock. I'd cover it with kelp. I would just do one slash with a Stanley knife. A lot of my work is about this, the dangers in the landscape. I've got this idea that the last bit of turf that is dug out in the earth because there's nothing left will be square, because the bulldozers will be cutting it in very straight lines. And then I would again go and find a bottle of water and douse it. This is a great picture. If you actually see a print of this, there's lots of little self-portraits of me in this kelp. There's one there. You can see legs of the tripod all reflected in it, and the clouds behind me. And there's one of them where I actually can see the cable release in my hand as I'm taking the picture. But what happened was, this is a picture of me on that beach. It's down Patrick Head. It's just the most beautiful place. I went along the beach to find a bottle to wet the area, and I found a message in a bottle. It had come from an island off Newfoundland and taken 7 years to get to Ireland. And it was in a 7-Up bottle. And it was just fantastic. But what was most fantastic was the actual bottle. It had thousands and thousands of scratches on it. So I started to just cut these bottles up and put them in an enlarger and make prints from them, just from the scratches. That's the neck of a Coca-Cola bottle. It's a close-up of it. A shampoo bottle from Canada. That's the other side. That's where the label was. It looks like a sunlit landscape or something, I don't know. I had a phase where I would make reservoirs on the plastic and fill it in with seawater and dry it. And then I was starting to get a little, I get fed up with things, and I'd start doing the same picture over and over, and I have to kind of move on. One of the things I was trying to do at the time was do things bigger. My darkroom could only cope with 24 prints. So I started to make these images that had 2 or 3 prints added together to make a big print. The other thing I was playing around with was toning, sepia toning. These were made by having taken a negative of a pebble and then drying some seawater on a glass plate and then sandwiching the two together and putting them in an enlarger and making prints. I tried Prussian blue toning to try and get some colour into the work, but it's very, very hard. Very unstable. This was a picture that was Prussian blue tone, and 3 days later it was washed out and there was no colour in it. But at this particular point, I discovered scanning. And amazingly enough, there's 2 people in this audience who are partly responsible for the scanning situation. Professor Keith Bevan from Lancaster University, who's somewhere, who was the first person to say to me, instead of putting these in an enlarger, you should scan them. The technology's moved on and you'd get really good results. And I thought, no way. Scanning, the devil's work. But then there's a guy, Roger Cuthbert, somewhere in the audience, who allowed me to go and play with his scanner and teach me the rudiments of scanning, and was very helpful. So I bought myself a scanner, and I started to work with Jack Lowe, the printer in Newcastle, digital printer. I should say that the darkroom thing it was 2007 we're up to now, and the whole world was changing in relation to digital and analog. Bits of my magic were disappearing. I used to print on Forte museum paper. In fact, they sponsored me for 7 years. I didn't buy a piece of paper for 7 years. And then they just sent me an email one morning saying, we're not making any paper anymore, we're closing tomorrow. The Agfa Newtol warm tone developer I used changed formula. So everything was changing all around me, and you were struggling to find the materials to carry on your magic. And I was introduced to Jack Lowe, and I got better at scanning, and we started to make digital prints, and it was absolutely liberating for me. All of a sudden I could do colour, I could do scale. These are just made with dried seawater, and I don't add colour in the computer. All these colours are in the seawater and the glass, I should say. Some of it must come from the glass. But this one's called Catch a Wave. Done from some seawater from County Mayo. I'm starting to do things quite big scale now. This print was something like 2 meters wide. I tried bringing seawater back from holiday. This is from Kefalonia. This is what happens with the scanner is if you scan the seawater as if it's a negative, you get earth tones, browns and greens. If you scan it as a positive, like a magazine page, you get blues and turquoises. They're opposite on the colour wheel, I suppose. Can bottoms became a big thing. I walk along what the Irish call the strand line, the last mark on a beach that the high tide has left. And there's always a few can bottoms because they're so rigid and solid that the sea can't sort of smash them away. Rust, again, now I'm into colour. It just opened up huge possibilities. Plastic. I've put this next slide up just to talk a little bit about the scanning process. I think of my scanner as a camera. It has got a depth of field. It's got all sorts of possibilities you can do to light things. This image was made by putting a reservoir on the scanner glass made of bath sealant, silicone bath sealant. The shells are in the middle, and then about half a pint of seawater is flooded in to the reservoir. And then also I light the scanner from the top. I leave the lid open. I have a series of things above the scanner so I can shine torchlight down. So you're getting light through the shells, you're getting light up from the bottom of the scanner to the shells, but also you're getting this incredible luminosity created by the things being in water. I had a really nice commission on the Isle of Mull, and they paid for me to live there for a couple of weeks and make work with stuff from their beaches. This is called Night Sky over Heineken, for the obvious reasons. The time I was there was that the herring gulls were all shedding their feathers, the young herring gulls. So every strand line I walked along had, and I don't usually use material that's so obvious as a feather, but it was just so much everywhere that I had to use it. I walk along the beach and I pick stuff up and I just walk along playing with it and looking at it and thinking thoughts about it. And this one day I picked a piece of fisherman's rope up and I was just unravelling, and I thought, oh, they look like waves. Simple idea. But I took it home and I made pictures, and so I made a whole series made out of fishing line and fishing rope. There's always this moon in the image. I think it comes from Samuel Palmer. But there's always this kind of one last dot of seawater I put on at the end to create a moon. This is a plastic bag and dried seawater. The seawater dries just like the patterns you get on sand. I was interested in Theo's talk, looking at the sand patterns and thinking, I can make seawater dry by putting a little bit of heat underneath, and sometimes I I blow through a straw to heat the area where the seawater is, and it will dry in these lines. It's a bit of a... I feel insane sometimes. I sit in my studio doing this and somebody said, "What did you do today?" "Oh, I just sat and blew a straw at some seawater on a piece of glass." This is the image that's upstairs. All my recent work I've been doing on light boxes, so it's an old image, but I did it on the light box. One day I found a piece of copper wire on the beach, and it was green at both ends, and I suddenly thought, "Oh, green, I can make green." Verdigris. So I started to make these series of, and a lot of the ideas were coming about. I was walking along with this piece of copper thinking, "Yeah, this is amazing. Where did this piece of copper come from?" I started to think about this room, places like this. If you could only see copper wire, what would this room look like if all you could see was copper wire? There's a huge trunk of it going down there to this sort of mixing desk. Every stair has got LED lights on it, which presumably have copper wire in. They'll be chased up the wall. They'll be across the ceiling for the ceiling lights. There'll be a web of copper, and it's all joined together. Somehow, it's all joined together through Penrith, and when I was doing this thinking and reading, I found out there's 270 undersea cables leave Great Britain to go to America and to Europe, so that you could trace copper everywhere, copper wire. And I had this thought that at some point all this copper had been rock, been dug out as rock, smelted, worked on. Human endeavour had created this kind of web of copper. So I try and get those kind of ideas into the work somehow. I'm not sure it always works, but this one I was thinking about this web idea, this kind of copper web. I started to just kind of make coloured seawater by cutting tiny bits of copper in and sort of soaking it for a few days and then just seeping it off, and I can get this kind of bluey green colour. Fertiliser bags I like, because when you scan them they sort of look like marble. I did a whole series of what I call remixes. I went back to my old negatives. I'm really into music, and I really like the idea in music of people doing remixes of records. So I just kind of went through in fact it started off, I was in my studio one day and I had a visitor, and I've got a shelf with probably 2,500 5.4 negatives in files on a shelf, and he says, "What are you going to do with those?" And I thought, well, if the Tate Gallery came knocking and saying we're going to do a major retrospective, there's probably only 100 pictures in there that I would want to choose from. There's 3,400 pieces of nonsense. What are they there for? So I started to dig them out and make these pictures I called remixes. So that these are two pictures of kelp I did in Ireland, and then overlaid with a glass plate with seawater on, and then scanned. This one has got a big light above the scanner to kind of create this sun effect. A grid line has started to appear in the work. It's about maps, and I love maps, and I love the windows, Georgian windows. It's this very, very easy symbol of human intervention in the landscape. I'm a big follower on Instagram of a feed called the Jefferson Grid. I don't know if any of you know it, heard of it. Thomas, forgive me for my American history, but from what I understand, after Thomas Jefferson had got rid of the Native Americans onto reservations, he had to turn the land into a commodity, so he organised this gridding of 1 mile square grids across the whole of America, and it's called the Jefferson Grid. And there's a guy person, I don't know if it's a guy at all, on Instagram. He goes over Google Earth, pores over Google Earth, finding remnants of these 1 square mile grid patterns. And because they've been bought by different people, different things have gone on them. So you can see next to them one might be a a grove of orange trees, and next to it a housing estate, but they're all in this perfect squares. It's a great feed. I would recommend it. Just 16 pieces of 7-Up bottle found from different locations, and a really big washer I found in Ireland, dried for about 3 months, dripping seawater under for about 3 months, and then removing the washer, and that was the result. This one, again, seawater dried on a glass plate with a can bottom. And I'm going to sort of nearly finish there, because I've noticed in all these talks there was no time for questions, and I love questions. Questions keep me on my toes, so I've left a bit of time for questions. I just wanted to link it though to that, because really when you think about it, I've not moved a long way, have I? A circle in a black square with some sort of life on it that could be planetary. That explains my whole work. Thank you.
So, do we have any questions? Any questions?
I'd be surprised if there's not.
How many scanners have you gone through?
I've gone through 4 scanners. In fact, recently I applied for something, and there was a question mark, a box in the questionnaire saying, what camera do you use? So I put Epson V700, and they rejected me out of hand. So I've been through 4 scanners. They're about 450, 500 quid each. One of them I had about half a pint of seawater on, and the bath sealant failed, and it all went down inside, and there was a big blue flash. And mostly I scratched them because I put huge things on them, heavy things, huge pieces of iron or stone. When I first started, they were very expensive to get a new glass, about 80 quid. But it's reduced now, and I can get a new glass for now for about £27. So I have 2 or 3 of those in store every time. And in fact, I've got a brand new scanner under my table in my studio, just in case I need to.
Do we have any other questions?
Loads.
To the message in the bottom.
I did reply to the message. I did reply. Yeah, it was a school project from this, and I sent a really nice letter saying I found this. I sent a photo. We had dried the letter was wet. So we dried it was in pencil, so we dried it out and I scanned it, and then with my scanning skills enhanced it a bit so you could actually read it properly. And I sent it back to the school and I got no reply. I thought that was really bad.
Anybody else?
Have you thought of the motif of a mandala?
Have you thought of the motif of a mandala?
I have, but I don't do too much tricks in the computer. In fact, one of the things I haven't said is if you really looked at all those pictures, the edge of the picture is never created in a computer. It's either the edge of a glass plate or it's a cut in the plastic. The edge of the black is created in a computer, but the actual edge of the image is never, it's always natural, or I've intended it. It's exactly as I intended it, not chance. So I think to start doing things in computers I've seen a lot of these things where you have quartered images and then reflected back on themselves, but no, I don't, my computer skills are really low. In fact, I've just done this really big commission for the Anne Lanter gallery on Harris in Stoneway, and they wanted a mural 26 foot wide, and it was a massive technical challenge for me in the computer, and I did it as a triptych, and each section was okay, and then when I tried to join the thing together my computer kept crashing, and I thought, why is it doing this, you know, why now, why of all times, why? And I only use Photoshop elements, I don't use full Photoshop, and I didn't realise that there's a pixel limiter in it of 30,000 pixels, which you can't go beyond. And this finished image was 60,000 pixels wide in order to be printed at the quality I wanted it printed. So.
Other question?
Do you still use a camera or not? Or do you restrict your...
Do you use a camera or not?
Yeah, I have a Lumix that I take to the beach with me, and I have an Instagram feed, and I do put pictures I've taken during the day or of my life or the garden or things on the beach. So I still use a camera. I just don't use any film or... I like the idea of moving forward. I think this idea of restricting yourself, and I don't really like all this we believe in film and movement. I once, when I did my fine art degree, I read a piece about Michelangelo, and I'm not comparing myself to Michelangelo at all, but it was about his studio and how it worked, and how it's like Damien Hirst. He had an arm painter, he had a drapery painter, he had a background landscape painter, and these things were moved along from person to person. And it said in this article that he spent most of his time dealing with the queue of people outside, bringing him new technology. So people were coming along saying, Michelangelo, I've got a great new plaster for the wall, your murals will sing on it, you know, or I've got a new blue, look at this blue, you've never seen a blue like this. And he was apparently very, very keen on taking this new technology, and I've got no doubts that if he was around now he'd be using scanners and 3D printers and audio-visual presentation.
Got a question from the chat on the projector row.
I was just wondering, when you get your seawater and you'll wash your can bottom or something like that, and it sits there drying, you mentioned 1 to 3 months. I was just wondering how you know when it's ready.
How do you know when they're cooked?
It speaks to me. It's really easy to tell. You overdo it. I mean, I don't work on one at the time. I mean, I'm working on maybe 10 at the time, maybe 8 or 10, and some of them are working and some of them aren't. And you can just sort of tell, really. It's a decisive moment.
Does it really make a lot of difference which beach or which sea you take this water from?
It's not huge, but it is different. The stuff I've got from Kefalonia dried very differently and dried a different colour. I think there must be minerals in the water. It doesn't really matter, but in my studio I have a sort of milk crate with these plastic bottles with tapes on saying where they were from. And so I've got, Downpatrick Head water from 1992 or whatever. It's a sort of just a shtick I do. I just make sure that I'm using the seawater from the same beach I collected the material from.
Tap water, the water from Bath with soap?
I've not tried that. I've tried peat, very peaty water, and you do get something off that, and it's a kind of project I've got stored away for future.
Another question from at the back.
If I think of yesterday, I see the morning as being about beauty and the afternoon about the message. Where do you see your works fitting on that scale?
Beauty or message?
I don't know, somewhere I heard a quote about somebody called themselves a seeker of truth and beauty. I think that's what I am. I'm a seeker of truth and beauty. I want my work to be beautiful. I want my work... Oh, if you walked in a room and one of my pictures was on the wall, I wanted you immediately to be engaged by it, be attracted to it, and I want it to be beautiful. But I also want you to look at it over a long period of time and maybe have some of the thoughts that I have about it, about how much copper there is in the world, or something like that.
Do you ever... I'll ask a question. Do you ever try and give the narrative across to people, or do you always let people read the narrative themselves?
I do. Titles helps.
Yeah.
I do. Most of my work has got titles, and I do sometimes try and slip into the title. In fact, when I was thinking of leaving my job, I did a day workshop with Paul Hill, and John Blakemore at a gallery called the Viewpoint Gallery in Salford. And one of the things I took away from that was hearing John Blakemore talk about titles. And he said something like, somebody asked him, why do you call these pictures this one? He said, well, sometimes the picture calls itself a title, you just know what it's called. And then he said, I've got other ones, I've got titles that haven't got pictures yet. And I thought that was one of the great things I took away from that day. And I thought, that's great, and I do that. I've got little notes in books of, in fact, my next book is called Oh Hanami. It's this work I did on the garden and the hedgerows around where I live. I did a show in London called Oh Hanami because I've been to Japan, and Oh Hanami is the cherry blossom season. They call it Oh Hanami. And when I spoke to a receptionist in my hotel and saying, what does Oh Hanami mean? She said, oh, well, the literal translation is flower watching. So people go out in the parks and they watch the cherry blossom. See, but the poetic translation is the celebration of transient beauty. I thought, wow, that's a line and a half, isn't it? And so I wrote it down, and it's going to be the subtitle of the book.
We've got time for one last question. I'll ask a question. I've got one more to ask. You mentioned music.
Yeah.
And listening to Miles Davis. Do you think, do you listen to the same music, or does music influence your creativity?
All the time, yeah. In the studio I have particular pieces of music. If I want to create a mood, I've got particular pieces of music. If I'm feeling blocked, I've got other pieces of music.
What sort of music do you listen to?
That's a question. My go-to piece is Brian Eno's atmosphere and soundtracks, Apollo, from the soundtrack to the film Apollo. If I want to kind of create a really calm mood in the studio, that's what I use.
A big thank you for Paul. Spellbinding talk again. Well, I'm sitting here with Paul Kenny, having just sat through, I would almost say, a mesmeric spellbinding talk with images. I mean, we talked about beauty.
Yeah.
And that's what they are.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just arresting beauty. I know you were talking about a message and whatever else, but thank you.
People are scared of beauty, I think. And I like saying beauty. In fact, when I was in art college, I started to do this work then. And the tutors laughed at it because it was too beautiful. So.
It's a strange thing. It's almost like, is it part of the art world thinks or dismissive of it because it's beauty, and therefore it either can't be trusted or isn't artistically sound because it should be perhaps more inaccessible. And what's wrong with, actually, as I said right at the start, when Rachel and I, my wife, walked past your work, and it really was a case of stopped and just stared. What's wrong with that?
I have a friend who's got one of my pictures by her telephone where she in her house, and she's had it 9 years. And she says, when I'm on the phone for 9 years, I'm looking at it and finding new things in it and new ideas.
That's a fair old phone bill, 9 years. But very intriguing. Over the course of the last 2 days, we looked at Thomas with the project he took on for the Atlantic Basin, 70,000 miles. And in yourself, smaller distances, but
70,000 centimetres.
But the time scale, 20 years photographing the same wall.
Yeah. I said I'd read this blog post that some woman wrote after I did this talk at the Arena conference in Bournemouth, and she said it wasn't a joke. She seriously was worried about my mental health and thought I needed some sort of therapy for. But it was an obsession. But I had a job, and I had to somehow do a full-time serious job and do my work so I had to kind of really compartmentalize it, so that obsession with going back to the wall just gave me a real strong grounding.
Was it, I suppose, a sense of peace and solitude going back to the same place?
Yeah. What I used to do was I would go for a week and live in a tent next to the wall, right. And then my family would come up to Inverness by train for the second week we'd have a cottage somewhere and we'd have a sort of family holiday. So it was a 1 week in a year when I could get away from work, get away from family, get away from everything and just be in the landscape, part of the landscape.
Do you find that you thought more freely when you were there, when you're just on your own, you've got no distractions, you've no family? Because obviously it's a family man. You heard Theo downstairs.
Yeah.
You know, he had to change the way he did things because he had two small children, didn't want to ignore them. So it's quite hard to reconcile all these other considerations coming in with, I suppose, almost a passion, a single-minded obsession, if you like. So it
was only 1 week a year, and I think that for that it was fair enough for what I did and how I earned my money and the stresses of life. I think to have 1 week a year when it's just you doing what you want to do. Other people go to Las Vegas and gamble. I went to Scotland and took pictures of stones.
The thing that struck me was the early picture of the Bill Brandt, and you've got almost like the street urchins with the canals, the railway, everything else. Could you ever foreseen in that picture looking at these just small moments of beauty?
No.
Are you still in touch with anybody from those days?
Oh yeah. They're all criminals and lags.
So what do they think? Have they seen you work?
They treat me really well. They treat me a bit like a sort of local hero.
Right.
And there's a particular pub I go in and...
You've not gone to the dark side?
No, they still think I'm down to earth and strong where I came from. So it's great. Yeah. I quite like that. It's quite a nice thing. It isn't like it, but it's a bit like David Bailey and the Craze or something, you know.
Yeah, it is it's a real crossover, if you like. Going from that upbringing, everybody else is still in that world behind you. You're here talking in front of a conference with 140, 150 people, live streaming to wherever. Your work's collected in exhibitions throughout the world.
Yeah, I'm very proud of it. I do. I mean, the one thing that happened this year is that I was on the GCSE syllabus, and I thought, I wish my parents were alive.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. It's need to mention this before we go any further, but I did mean to. We were talking over a wee gin the other night, and Paul was saying that he'd been asked to do a wedding, and I just thought, that is just such a strange wedding photograph with the bride's head sort of squashed down on the scanner and the lid. I just had that image in my head.
I don't know why they asked me, because I if you're a photographer, you think you can do anything, just make images anyway. But I don't know where it's going to go as well. I like the moving forward. I love the kind of using the new technology that's coming along. I've been looking at 3D printing at the moment.
Well, in a way, the light boxes are almost 3D because the light's coming in from behind, and it's given it a real sense of depth, and it glows. It really attracts the attention.
Yeah, it's partly to do with the world of photography becoming so huge and ubiquitous. You can't move for photographers. I meant to say during the talk, actually, the first 2 years I went to Scotland, to the West Coast, I saw one other person with a tripod. Yeah. One other person in 2 years, and now you can't move for it. And
well, I have friends on Skye who are talking about moving out of Skye because they just can't move during the summer months. You have other people in the North Coast 500, and it's all tourism. It adds money to the infrastructure, but at the expense of what? The expense of the last remaining unspoiled wildernesses in the country.
The light boxes were a kind of reaction to that. And how do you make something special in a world where everybody's making big photographs?
Can you see, we're talking before Tim's last question about the music, because music's very important to me, and that's what I used to use to relax before I went into photography. Do you see yourself doing anything with an audio-visual, or is that just a private thing, listening to the music?
No, I've seeing, is it Sandra?
Sandra and Theo were both very much into
I thought Sandra's worked better slightly, but I thought her audio visual was amazing. It did give me some ideas.
Well, because it's all about the emotional aspect, isn't it? So if if you listen to music for the emotional content for the way it makes you feel, a possible extension, I suppose, of just moving on from light boxes to.
Yeah, my son's a musician. He's played in bands since he was 12. So I have, maybe sometime we'll do something together.
Yeah, perhaps not with the bagpipes you just got at auction. That might not create the right ambience. But it's an interesting way of looking at things.
Yeah.
We're just trying to cope with the noise from the kids down
I
the
know.
other side.
I wondered if Joe's ever thought about using 3D printing. Have you considered it?
We've just got Joe on the other side of the camera, and he's nodding his head wisely when we're talking about 3D printing.
I saw a video called, and I make a note of this and go and have a look at it because it's really interesting. The New Rembrandt, it's called. It was funded by the ING Bank, and they got a lot of scientists and computer specialists. They 3D scanned every Rembrandt, and they amalgamated it into a computer and created an average Rembrandt portrait. And then it's 3D printed, which got impasto paint marks on it. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, that's amazing. If I could get my salt crystals three-dimensional, or the pieces of fishing line three-dimensional, it would create something very, very special. Yeah.
Do you ever think about going back to your wall?
I do go back to the wall, but it's very hard to get to.
You speak to the landowner and get some access in?
No, it's the Applecross estate, and they've just decided they don't want deer getting on the beach, so they put it's a 10 foot high.
Ah, right, okay then.
But I found if you walk about 300 yards, there's a gate you can get through, but you have to walk 300 yards back, and it's quite difficult for me.
The Applecross estate, I'm fairly sure the guy who runs it worked for one of the big auction houses, actually, because he spoke to me a while back about doing some pictures over a period of time.
All right.
From the estate.
Oh well.
But I think that was in exchange for the use of a holiday cottage for a couple of days.
Mention my name.
So, have you enjoyed the experience?
It's been really good, really good. It's fantastic to be with a group of other people who are all trying to do something interesting. Yeah.
I think that's been the great thing about the conferences is, if you like, the ambience, but everybody, and we're carrying on today. You and yourself going back through the stuff from Bill Brandt, and you had Theo with his audio visual.
Yeah.
So it's a big blend. Anyway, thank you very much for
Thanks,
coming,
Mark.
Thanks very much for
Thanks a
talking to
lot.
us.
Thanks.